thank our entire staff, Kirsten and Casino, your entire team for really some great staff work, which is very, very complex. I'd like to thank people from the community for showing up and certainly having an obvious interest in this. Again, it's very, very complex. I think it's important that we approach this with caution and not with headline, black, white, stereotype approaches. So I have a few questions, you know, some of it has to do with the prior study and the condition of the soil in 2005, which of course showed that the soil was clean after bioremediation, which involved factor, which is different from phytoremediation, totally different from phytoremediation, which is planting, for example, poplar trees that actually absorb and allow wicking up of the deodorant into the trees, etc. The first question is this, and that's, I noticed that as of 2005, the exposure point concentration, which is the milligrams over kilograms, was 0.40. It was 0.40. And yet now in 2014, I would actually look at 2016 is from the Geocom report. And by the way, was the testing done in 2016 or 2014?
2014. Excuse me, 2014, 2015. But the first initial, I believe the first assessment was done in 2014, and then we had a targeted site assessment with more samples done in 2015. The report was actually issued in 2016 by the time we processed all the data.
So thanks. So when I look at this number 0.69, that's as of sometime in 2015?
Correct.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm curious, you know, maybe the gentleman from Geocom could help us understand, how did it get from 0.4 to 0.69? We know that there's been no deodorant in use since 1989. I know it's insoluble, it's a very hardy substance. And I know also that it doesn't leach. So, how did that happen?
That is an excellent question.
Yeah,
I don't know anybody in this room that knows the answer to that question, because we've asked that again and again. You know, it's considered, the term is rebound. So whether it was rebounded because of the application of bioremediation, or that there could have been some sort of application afterwards of a substance or soil that contained deodorant, we don't know.
Okay.
One of the speakers mentioned bioconcentration as it moves up the food chain as well. So if there's an organism that eats it and concentrates it, and you know, that could be. So there's theories related. If there's anybody in this room that knows how that could happen, we also talked with DTSC when we went up to Sacramento, and it's an unanswered question. So thank you, Steve.
There is a possibility of there being sampling error from event to event or laboratory error as well.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up.
The other thing that, in talking with DTSC, that we've had conversations with is the property was farmed post 2005.
Right.
So there was farming that occurred on the property, and so we can't say what it was, but we know that the site conditions changed as well.
Okay.
Right.
And then I also noticed that, you know, the screening level was 0.034. The exposure point, which is the hot spot, I guess the greatest point of take, I guess, for the deodorant, is 20 times higher. That's not throughout the entire property. That's just those hot spots.
Correct.
So it's not 10 acres of 0.69. Very important point.
Oh, yeah, correct.
So if somebody were to use that 0.69 as the exposure,
Right.
the assumption is that there's somebody on that actual spot for 30 years
Right.
being exposed to that soil.
Right.
at that point.
Right. I think these kinds of things are very important, because when you look at some of the numbers, it's quite startling. And also another point, and I want to validate this, is that even though this would be, from the DTSC standpoint and EPA standpoint, potentially carcinogenic or hazardous to the touch, or in terms of airborne, even so, when this waste is, and is a question, when this waste is disposed, it is still not considered hazardous waste because it's not at 0.8. It's at 0.69 maximum exposure point concentration, right? So this is not hazardous waste that we're disposing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah,
It
no,
was,
it's not.
you couldn't dispose of it at class 2 landfill, class
Right.
3 landfill.
Yeah, just wanted to validate
So,
that.
yeah, there's a designation, I
Right.
don't know what the designation is, of what concentration is hazardous waste, but it's not hazardous
I
waste.
think Chris can speak to that, right? I mean,
The haz waste level for Dieldrin is 8.0 ppm.
8 points are right here, so it's
and-
far away.
And our concentration is 0.69
That's the high.
ppm.
High
80
effect.
times
Yes.
Now, in terms of the actual methodology, I understand that we are going to propose 3 alternatives, is that correct? And one was off-haul, one was
bioremediation.
bioremediation. And what kind of bioremediation are we thinking of?
Well, it'd be similar to what was, well, the bioremediation in general would be through like a company like Bio, there's certain proprietary components, so it'd be like there's special companies that engineer it specifically for it. So I guess I don't have a specific method. What we'd have to do is hire a consultant that would come in, actually field engineer whatever this methodology is. So I couldn't say that it was, say, 2 parts A, 2 parts B. It'd be, they'd come in, do other sampling testing, engineer an enzyme or protein that would break down with the actual biology on site, test fit that, figure out if it works, test fit it on a larger scale, and then roll it out. So they used biofactor back in 2005 with some success for toxaphene and lower levels of dieldrin. Again, the confidence level in what that is, because there is this, our test samples are higher than before. When I looked at it, we didn't investigate any further because clearly there's dieldrin there now in a higher concentration than what before in 2005 after treatment, when it was certified clean. So the conservative approach to us was to off-haul. So I don't have I guess my answer is I don't have a specific method, although I do know there are firms that do that work and they would engineer that method for that site.
Yeah, I just, I wanted to also point out that differentiation is important. The kind of bioremediation that was done back in 2004, 05 contrasted with what is done today in places, not yet in a school site, because I know the 29 or 31 so far cases have been off-hauling. But there is something called phytoremediation. I know that a consultant has talked to McCloskey about that.
Nice looking to me.
And is that something you're still interested in pursuing? The cost was going to be 1/4 of what the cost would be here. It would take approximately a year and a half to 2 years, but is that something you're still interested in pursuing?
Well, I mean, so the number one thing is safety and efficacy that's the order of priority. So I guess to speak to the phytoremediation, I couldn't find it as a proven method based on the Proven Technologies Handbook from DTSC. So although bioremediation was, phytoremediation was not. And all the cases that we found for phytoremediation doing research were for groundwater, which this pesticide is not, it attaches to soil and fats and not water. So everything I saw for phytoremediation, the case studies were treating groundwater. So it didn't seem like a viable, it perhaps could be a component in speaking to, or actually, I think McCloskey spoke in depth about the technology, but it still involved having a biofactor with the phytoremediation and having a.
Yeah, and then in terms of the, yeah,
So I guess no is the answer if we didn't.
yeah. And so I want to make sure I understand this right. What we're going to be doing is off-hauling the soil, and then what would we do to the land itself? No capping. Sounds like no capping.
Yeah.
We'll be maybe grading and then testing it. Is that correct?
So the process for off-haul in a nutshell would be to off-haul the contaminated soil, confirm testing and make sure we're clean, get certification from DTSC. And then the grading component would happen as a course of construction. So it's a completely separate process that would be part of the grading, doing the parking lots, building pads.
We would not be taking new soil in from elsewhere.
Not for the time of, not as a component of remediation. We've finished our topography and we're looking at how, because we're gonna have to dig down the site regardless in order to do asphalt, to do building structure. So when we look at the balance, we're not digging it to restore it back to a field, we're digging it for a section for school buildings. So right now we don't know that total balance, but we know we're gonna end up digging the site down probably about 1 foot or 6 inches anyway. So we'll have that as part of schematic design once we get the site clean.
In terms of the cost, 1.87 million. I realize that's just 0.3 million underneath the 2 million cap, which would drive an RAP instead of an RAW, correct? And so I'm hearing that we're going to be wetting down all of the soil. And I also heard that we're talking about 38,000 tons of soil we're planning to excavate and haul off. And so I do know that when you wet soil down, it becomes heavier. And so is that 38,000 dry tons, or is that wet tons?
Well, again, the Rockets will put that together. I don't know. I think they consider it tons when we use a factor of 1.7 or 1.8 to convert cubic yards into tons, which is pretty typical for off-fall. And I believe that is wet. Yeah, that's
You just factor in the conversion of the soil types into the, from cubic yards in place to factor in based on the density of the soil and stuff, and the moisture content. And we established at 1.7 tons per cubic yard,
Okay.
which is pretty good for moist soil.
Okay, so this is moist, 1.87 million is moist soil. So therefore, we would not expect us to go over 2 million, which would drive a different regulatory process.
And in addition to that, I'd like to chime in that, again, to the point of we have a certain sample size of those that you saw in the PA, those certain character samples. We're learning about the process even further. We thought that there might be value to doing further character samples and really zoning into how deep we have to go. What we presented is the worst case. If we have some time between now and spring to do additional character samples and really dial into how deep those soils are. And we were strategizing. So what we'd like to come in with is a more conservative effort, showing where we are, and then moving forward to kind of create a value without having any additional risk, but to really just zone in on keeping it true to what the actual depth is. So that's that.
So it might be cheaper actually than 1.7.
We would hope.
1.7.
We would hope.
Thank you.
Well,